You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities. We're doing our thing here, still in the book of 2 Samuel.
Chapter 5.
Yep, we just started on David's anointing.
Well, he's been anointed. We're actually getting ready to move into him conquering Jerusalem. And
Okay.
yeah, well, come on, we took 5 minutes to go look at the ducks.
Yeah, well, that's exactly how my brain works.
Ducks. Everything else is gone.
Yeah, looking at the wildlife.
So, yeah.
Speaking of distracting, I gotta slow that down. I'm gonna be watching the whole time. Okay, sorry. I was looking at our recording program here.
It's good to have something like that on your end, because I feel like I'm always talking about where I can't read my own handwriting. So
I had one of the things set where it was the wave pattern was moving way too fast. It was distracting.
Those are like hypnotic. You have to look at them. So we left off a week ago for everybody listening, and 2 minutes ago for us. David's getting ready to conquer Jerusalem, and we went to look at kind of the significance and importance of Jerusalem, because it's a big thing with a lot of religions. I mean, it's a major city for so many different faiths, and it seems like it's just always been that way.
Right.
And it's kind of fascinating that this place has so much significance. Now, we talked about some of the extra biblical sources that mention Jerusalem and the things we can discover about it through archaeology. And now we're going to move into what the Bible has to say about Jerusalem as a city. Our first mention of Jerusalem goes all the way back to Genesis 14:18. And this is when Abraham has just rescued Lot after Lot had been captured in what's known as the Battle of the Four Kings. And this was an interesting story. We have an episode on it, so you can go back and listen to that. But Melchizedek arrives during all of this.
Mhm.
And he's described as the king of Jerusalem, the king of Salem,
Yeah.
which is another name for Jerusalem. And he's also described as a priest of the Most High. So he's a king and a priest. This is going to be very important in David's theology moving forward. And we're going to talk about that as we get there, because another fascinating component of David's reign. Now, the Amarna tablets, which we talked about in the last episode, which are those letters from the Egyptian overseer of Canaan to Pharaoh, they're older than the Bible, but the Bible reports evidence that's earlier than the Amarna tablets. So I think that makes sense. Basically, the Bible's recording events that happened around 2000 BCE. It's real hard to get precise on these dates, because once you get so old and so far back there, it's really difficult to get more than just an around this time period. And, that's okay. But the next mention we have of Jerusalem, we go all the way from Genesis to Joshua 10. And this is when the king of Jerusalem attacks Gibeon for making peace with Israel. And this is the famous battle where the sun stands still.
Mm-hmm.
So some significant times that it's showing up. And in this passage, the king of Jerusalem is referred to as one of 5 Amorite kings who were fought, later defeated, and their bodies were hung. So again, significant time, major battle. And Joshua 15 and Judges 1 both report a battle against the inhabitants of Jerusalem during the Canaanite conquest. So in Joshua 15, we're told that Jerusalem is part of Judah's allotment. And in Joshua 16, we're told that it's part of Benjamin's allotment. So it's very interesting that the city belongs to both Judah and Benjamin, given the situation with David being from the tribe of Judah and Saul being from the tribe of Benjamin.
Right.
So in Judges 1, it tells us that the two tribes share the city. And verse 8 of Judges 1 says, Judah captures it and sets it on fire. And this is where, when we were talking about Adonai-Bezek, the king who had his thumbs and his big toes cut off in the previous episode, this is where he dies. So the the story of Jerusalem within the Bible is very sparse until we get to David, but this kind of amuses me because if you look at Joshua 15:63, this is how it reads. It says, "But the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the people could not drive them out. So the Jebusites dwell with the people of Judah to this day."
Mm-hmm.
Now, fast forward to Judges 1. But the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day.
Mm-hmm.
So in Joshua, the writer blames the Judites for not driving out the Jebusites.
Right.
And in Judges, the writer blames the Benjaminites for not driving them out. And it's because they both live in the city together. And I think what you're seeing there is a little bit of bias on the part of the writer of Joshua versus the writer of Judges and who he's blaming for this failure.
Right.
And the thing is, it was the responsibility of both these tribes to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And the point in both verses is no one stepped up to do it. No one did what they were supposed to do. And so the consequence is the Jebusites are still living in Jerusalem this whole time throughout the entire period of the Judges, through the reign of Saul. They're still in the city. And so this becomes problematic for David. Now, David chooses the city, if we want to be just very practical about the matter. It's the perfect place for his reign because his biggest obstacle as a king is to unite Benjamin with the rest of the nation. I mean, they have just had one of their own removed from power, and they're a little bit sketchy on whether or not they should trust David.
Right.
And so for him to choose this as the place where he's going to rule, it is kind of symbolic of a desire to unite everyone together. And it's the perfect location for his capital. And we still have this issue of who the Jebusites were. The Bible really never clarifies exactly who we're talking about, because if you go back to Genesis, they're just an unnamed people group who live in the city. When we look in Joshua, they're named as Amorites, but they're identified as Jebusites. So they're part of the Amorite nation according to Joshua. In Samuel, they're just called Jebusites. And the reason why it's so important to figure out who the Jebusites are is because it determines how they're going to fit into a larger picture. And this is where things get really kind of crazy because we've got a lot of variables, and I'm not sure I have a great answer for this question, despite it being important. So we're just going to look at the variables, and I'll let people kind of weigh the evidence and come to their conclusions. Because the Jebusites themselves are named among the nations that are supposed to be devoted completely to destruction, that Harem.
Sure.
And so if the people in Jebus at the time of David are true Jebusites, then David is fulfilling a long neglected command of the Torah to drive them out. And this connects him back to Moses. And as David's first official duty and act as king, it proves that he is devoted to upholding the Torah. However, if they're Philistines, they're not covered in this mandate by the Torah as one of the nations that should be devoted to Quran. So we lose our connection to the Torah, and we lose the connection back to Moses, at least in this instance. However, they are still supposed to be driven out because driving out the Philistines is the purpose of having a king. And that was one of Saul's great failures. But then we've got this weird thing where the verse that we had just read says that the Jebusites had said, even the blind and lame are going to ward you off. And so we've got to figure out if this helps us understand who the people are.
Yeah, because it's kind of a weird verse, and there's a question. If you look at it, is it even our weak people can defeat you, or is it we've blinded and maimed so many people, you're going to be terrified by what we can do?
And those are the questions the rabbis bring to the table, because what you're reading there is dead on. I mean, now, If
which one?
well, that's a good question because rabbis don't like to offer solutions either. They give you ask, for a two-option question and they give you five more options. I mean, this is how they go about things, and then they never resolve anything. So
That's how it seems to be.
yeah, no, and I like that because again, we are all about the conversation. So if we connect the story back to Genesis 21, Abraham makes a treaty with the king of the Philistines, Abimelech. And they claim that under this treaty, Abraham and his descendants could not take land from the Philistines. And so to remove the Philistines from the country was a violation of this treaty. And the written document, according to the story, which is a great story, is that the written document that Abraham and Abimelech signed was placed in the mouth of two idols. And these two idols stood at the gates of Jabus, and their names were the blind and lame. And these two idols would rise up and fight David and in protection of the treaty made by Abraham. Probably not a great solution, but it is a fun story.
And
So
why would you have idols called blind and lame?
why do you have idols called death? I mean, I don't know. This is
I mean, if they're supposed to be protectors.
right? Or maybe the idea was they could blind and lame anyone who attacked them. I these are great. I don't know. I mean, these are the things that make you wonder about the way people perceive their idols.
Yeah, it's very strange.
I think that's one of the harder things for modern readers to connect to in the Bible because we don't have that mindset. And even in the church, where we do consider spiritual powers and spiritual warfare to be very real things, we've been told for so long that idols are worthless nothings, that they have no power, that for us to think of them as having power is just completely, it's beyond anything we've been conditioned to even consider.
Right.
And these people really did believe that their idols possessed power. And I think that's part of the beauty and part of the advantage of the divine council worldview is it really forces you to understand and grapple with the idea that spiritual forces were manifest and that the Bible never disavows the fact that these spiritual entities have power.
Right.
And if you want to talk about, I didn't plan to go here, but there is a really great book by Benjamin Sumner, The Bodies of God in the Old Testament, or I probably butchering that title, but he talks about the significance of idols and how they did and they housed these spiritual forces according to the way people looked at the objects they worshiped, and how you could have multiple idols of the same God in several different areas and it still not diminish the God.
Right.
And so, and the funny thing is, while it does not diminish the God, it still limits the God. So it's a very interesting dichotomy of thinking that we as the modern audience, we've just lost. And so I think it's really good for us to go back and think about these things and try to consider how would we view it if we did believe spiritual forces and spiritual entities were real and they had the ability to impact our lives. How would we represent this? And I say the modern audience, I should probably narrow that down to modern American, modern European, because if you still go to places like, South America and Africa and India and some of these other countries where spirituality is still practiced in a very tangible way. It's not just an abstraction. You still find these representations of these gods as being part of their worship. And so I think that this would probably be easier for them to wrap their minds around than us. But another solution to this verse is that these were Hittites. And so in Genesis 23, Abraham buys a field from the Hittites so that he can bury Sarah. And so he purchases specifically from Ephron the Hittite. And the story is said to illustrate that Jews should always purchase land from the Hittites, not take the land, even if it's offered as a gift. Because when Abraham tried to buy
Mhm.
the field, he tried to give it to Abraham, and Abraham refused. Now, the Hittite solution proposes that under the terms of the agreement with Abraham, that even the blind and the lame could hold land against Israelite invasion.
Okay.
And so that even the weak ones, like you were saying, are capable. That's all they need for defense. And it has the added benefit of explaining why later David is going to buy a field from a Jebusite. That's going to be in 2 Samuel 24:18 through 25. So,
Okay.
um, and God responds to the prayers of David at this place where he bought the field. And this is where David built an altar. Now, like I said, these are fun solutions. There's probably a better answer that doesn't require we add so much to the text and can be supported from some archaeological evidence.
Okay. Do you have any of that?
I do. I have a
Oh,
little
good.
bit. So yeah.
Hmm.
Thank you, Becca. So Jerusalem's a small city at this point. It's only 12 acres, which uh, if you live in the country, you know what a 10-acre plot looks like pretty easily. So
Sure.
it's a 12-acre plot. And Bergen describes this actually as a city that sits on a finger-like hill that comes out from the mountains.
Mm.
And on each of the three sides, there were very steep valleys. So it made attack very limited. It was hard to get to. The defense of the city was so easy because of the geographical formations that the blind and the lame were all that were needed to protect it. And I think that's really what's being said here is our city is so well placed that we don't have to work hard in order to defend it. And I mean, obviously, if the Jebusites have, and assuming that it's been possessed by the same people from Genesis onwards, because we don't have any record of the city switching hands from Genesis in the Bible from the original inhabitants. If the same people group managed to maintain control of that city, then they were capable of defending it. It was a city that was easily defended, and there weren't a lot of people who could overthrow it. So we're going to move on to verse 7, and we're going to talk about how the city was overthrown because David comes up with a unique solution. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. So this is the first time in the Bible that we encounter the name Zion.
Okay.
Its meaning is unknown, despite the number of times it's used. We have no clue. Zamora suggests that it's based on an Arabic word that might mean a fortress located on a ridge, which makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
And it fits with the descriptions of the physical location. So, verse 8, David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. So David offers up a battle plan, and he takes advantage of Jerusalem's one weakness, and it's the water supply, which if you've studied any siege warfare at all.
First thing you got to take care of.
Exactly. So on the southeastern slope of the city, there's a 49-foot vertical shaft that carries water from the Gihon Spring into the city during siege times. And the idea here is that David's sending his men into that shaft to get into the city. Now, for a long time, this was not a widely accepted or even a viable option because of linguistic issues, which I'm not going to nerd out on what all those are.
Okay.
But more recent archaeology has revealed that it might be time to reconsider this, that this is an appropriate translation. And so that I had a real hard time getting a picture of what all the archaeological evidence showed. And so I'm not even going to try to articulate it, but you can look up the different water systems and get diagrams and see how it could come into play. But a lot of these water tunnels and conduits they just weren't found until recently. And so now we know that there are actually, there's these shafts that would allow going up this vertical shaft an actual possibility and make it a plausible means.
Strategy.
Yeah, exactly. A plausible strategy for taking over the city. So this verse is also another verse that causes problems because it says David in his soul, he hates the blind and the lame. Now, David is not referring to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. He is referring to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, not people who are actually blind and lame. And he's turning the Jebusite, I don't know why I keep wanting to say Philistines. He's turning the Jebusite taunt back on them. And he is basically saying that their defenders of the city aren't any more effective than the blind and the lame. And as far as not being allowed in the house, this is not saying that the blind and the lame are not allowed in the house, as in the temple, as some people have read it, or even that they won't be allowed in David's palace, because we are going to find out later that David actually invites at least one lame person to always sit at his table. So this is not a prohibition against the temple or David's house, because the blind and the lame could enter into the temple. They just couldn't serve as priests. And so we have to be careful not to insert too much in the reading.
Mhm.
And so David's saying the defeated inhabitants of Jerusalem are not going to be allowed to partake in what's going to be the bounty of his rule. And he's making sure that they know that only Israel is going to benefit from what he has to offer the country because these people have stood in his way. Now, First Chronicles 11, 4 through 9 offers a slightly different version. And I'm going to pick up in verse 6. It says, David said, whoever strikes the Jebusite shall be chief and commander. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went up first, so he became the chief. So Chronicles is interesting in that it completely avoids talking about all of the problems with Joab and Abner. It never goes into that story that we went over a couple of weeks ago. It doesn't talk about how Abner is the real power behind Ishbosheth. And in fact, when Saul dies in Chronicles, there's no challenge. There's no one who could even possibly be considered for the throne other than David.
Mhm.
So all of Saul's descendants are kind of erased from the story. And David takes power without any kind of perceived delay. In Samuel, the writer is stopping to address the idea that these powerful generals can actually be problematic and that they can become the true power behind the throne. And, they can become, in all, practical purposes, they become the king, where the king is just a figurehead. But the writer in Samuel here is going out of his way to be perfectly clear that David conquered Jerusalem and no one else can even share in the glory. So we don't have this mention of Joab in the story in Samuel.
Okay. In Chronicles.
No, we don't have it in Samuel.
Okay.
But we have Joab in Chronicles showing
Gotcha.
up, and he becomes the one who actually facilitates. David gives the command, but it's Joab who conquers the city.
Okay, I got you now.
Yeah. And, in Chronicles, Joab is a celebrated general. He is David's right-hand man. There's no reason to really have any kind of doubt about him, but Samuel wants you to have that doubt. And in Samuel, his role really is downgraded into something very negligible because we aren't supposed to celebrate him too highly. Why? Because David's position isn't cemented yet in Samuel. We're still having to make that apologetic for David's reign over Saul's house, because we're having to prove that David is the right king.
Right.
And so whenever Samuel talks about these issues where there could be a confusion of power, it's always going to come down on the side of reminding you David is the right and appropriate king. Where Chronicles is going to say David was such a great king, he could have these powerful men at his side. And there wasn't any kind of threat to his power, even though they were such amazing leaders. So this is where we see how the writers are writing to two different audiences. They aren't contradicting each other. They're just giving you the elements that support what their audience needs to hear or what they believe their audience needs to hear. So,
Makes sense.
verse 9, David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David, and David built the city all around from the Millo inward. Now, calling a conquered city by the name of the one who conquered it was very common in ancient Near East cultures.
Sure.
And so David, we're seeing him follow the tradition of the culture of his time. Milo is an interesting word. It means filled up. So he built the city all around from the filled up parts inward. And it's believed that David at this time is when he began to extend Israel to encompass these pre-existing Jebusite terraces that they had built down from the city. And these were pieces of land that the Jebusites had previously filled up. And the need for this extensive kind of building program is going to be revealed soon as we get into the rest of David's reign. But 12 acres isn't a large place to house 600 people and 600 men and their families.
Right.
So you've got to think about the terms of what, in the terms of the numbers that David's bringing to this area. So verse 10, and David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. So just in case you forgot, the writer wants you to remember David's greatness is credited to one source. This is the Lord, the God of hosts. This is the title that Hannah used for God in her prayer in Samuel 1:11. It's the title that refers to an ordered army, and even it can refer to creation. And so, Hannah had appealed to the warrior side of God. And she's praying that those who held power in the day would be overthrown and displaced, because she understood it would be a battle. And it's kind of appropriate that the answer to her prayer and prophecy is this warrior king, and who's turned the values of Israel on its head, because that's what her prophecy was all about. Was if you go back to 1 Samuel 2, it's all about this reversal in which the poor are going to be lifted up, that those who had done without are going to have plenty. And we're seeing him embody these concepts because he is that warrior king. He's bringing equality to the people. He's won the hearts of his enemies through love, through patience, as far as the enemies within his own country. And, such a man can only exist and achieve this kind of greatness if he is upheld by God. So David is the fulfillment of the prophecy. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that David is not he's not a self-made man.
Right.
He's not someone who was just so good at fighting that we should all respect him, which is how a lot of people in his day would have viewed him if they didn't have this idea that gods were using humanity to fulfill their plans. So when we talk about David, we need to look at why he was necessary. And he was necessary not because Saul was a terrible king. He's necessary because it goes right back to Shiloh. It goes right back to the Levite and the concubine. It goes all the way back to this period of Judges where people were doing what was right in their own eyes.
Yeah.
And so now God is basically bringing in someone who can turn all these things around. And I love the fact that it's Hannah that is the catalyst for this change. So I probably talked enough about that on previous episodes. We're going to talk about it again, but we'll put it aside for now. So verse 11, and Hiram, the king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees, and carpenters, and masons who built David a house. And David knew the Lord had established him over Israel, and he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. So if we read this in context with where we are in the text, there's nothing to suggest that Hiram's presence is anything less than positive. David's king. He's risen to prominence, so much so that other kings from foreign nations are saying, hey, we need to make pals with this with this new king. And it's politically smart for Hiram to show up because Israel shares a border with Phoenicia where Tyre was located. So it's good to be friends.
Yep.
It's good economics. A king of a fledgling nation, he's going to be building. This is what kings did. As soon as they came into power, they built new things, whether it was temples, palaces, roadways, waterways. And what way to advertise you can offer all of these services to him than with a gift?
Right.
We do it today. Let me show you how great I am. Um, it's good economics because all of the trade routes, anything south of Tyre, was going to take them right through Israel. So
Mhm.
if they want to trade with Egypt, they've got to go through Israel.
Yep.
Who's going to be one of your biggest buyers of your products? Egypt. I mean,
Mhm.
that's just the facts of the situation. Now, if you're an astute Bible reader, this is kind of ominous and foreboding because when we talk about Tyre, there's a specific passage that comes to mind for almost every Bible scholar, which is Ezekiel 28.
Okay.
And it's the prophecy against the prince of Tyre.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so if you studied anything about spiritual warfare, Satan, the divine council worldview, you're going to be familiar with that. And Tyre's in a Phoenician city. Their high god was El. Um, and El had a divine council,
Mhm.
described very much in the terms that we find applied to God. And the opening of the chapter of Ezekiel 28, God confirms what we have often affirmed. Kings were representatives of the gods, and they were worshipped as if they were gods. So I
Right.
don't think we can say that too often. And so verse 2 of Ezekiel 28 says, because your heart was proud, and you have said, I am a god. And remember, this is being written to the prince of Tyre. I sit on the seat of gods in the heart of the seas, yet you are but a man and no God. So there's this really interesting thing that goes on with this chapter when the opening verses talk about the humanity, the person sitting on the throne. And then in verse 11, Ezekiel shifts his language and we began to see a different picture of who God's talking to because he says, you were in Eden, the garden of God. That's verse 13, being covered in jewels and polished precious metals.
Mhm.
Verse 14 says, you were an anointed cherub. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain, God. In the midst of the stones of fire, you walked. So you cast, this verse 16. I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub. So he's not talking to a man at this point. He's talking to a spiritual being. And more in the chapter, you can see that this is God is really talking about that dichotomy, or that not even a dichotomy, that interplay between a human ruler and the spiritual power
Mhm.
behind it.
Mhm.
And it makes sense when you have this idea that kings were representatives of the gods.
Right.
It's not confusing.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I know which passage you're talking about now that you've gone through it. I can never remember anything by the numbers.
I have a hard time with that too.
But it's kind of interesting because you see trends change and different things come
Mhm.
out with different bits of scholarship. And I do remember, being told that was, a description of Satan
Mhm.
growing up. And then there was, for a while, it was really big to say, no, 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 he's just describing a king there. Everyone's all
Mhm.
confused about it. It has nothing to do with spiritual warfare. And now it's like back to the other side. It's very interesting
But I
to
think
see the shifts in how the church looks at that.
and I think that when you're looking at people who do serious scholarship on it, we've kind of brought the pendulum swing back to the middle
Yeah.
because it's not just about a man, and it's not just about Satan. And even if it was about Satan, that's a good question because we could talk about the development of the Satan
Oh
figure.
yeah, well, yeah, that's a convoluted mess of things, and
Exactly.
it's very, I mean, it is very interesting to think about that because the modern concept of what a lot of Westerners think of when we think of Satan is not at all what they would have thought of in the
Right.
ancient world. I mean, the Israelites, when we talk about how Job, the Satan, it was an office. It wasn't necessarily the divine rebel character that we think
Right.
of it, and at the end of Genesis or at the end of Revelation that's cast in. But that's a whole
Right. Or
can of worms.
oh yeah, yeah. And so we won't go there. But for people who want to follow up, because I didn't want to, I just wanted to show why this is kind of ominous. If you've been reading your Bible and paying attention,
Mhm.
so For people who want to take it further, I'm going to recommend that you go to Unseen Realm, the book by Dr. Heiser. If you don't want to buy the book, you can go to episode 143 of the Naked Bible.
Okay.
So that way you can follow up and read more. And he's going to talk on there about how Ezekiel 28 is connected with Isaiah 14, and Isaiah 14 is connected to Genesis 3. And in Isaiah 14, that's where we get the translation from the Hebrew into the Latin, where we get the term Lucifer. And so, again, in Isaiah 14, what we see in that verse is we have an earthly ruler being, or that chapter, an earthly ruler being warned. And then we have these really in-depth description of spiritual events that are taking place or have taken place, and they exceed any kind of human experience as far as we know.
Right.
And so in these prophecies, God warns, Ezekiel and Isaiah, God warns this heavenly prince that the earthly representative of this God, that he's going to experience consequences for not following the true God. And so when I was working through this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I thought it was interesting, so I wrote it down, and it finally kind of clicked to me why we had to have 40 years in the desert, and why we had to have that period of judges, and why Israel didn't just arrive in Canaan and install a king over all the land, because in the ancient times the gods were territorial gods, and they're very tied to the land. And even in some stories, whenever you took the god out of their land, they lose their power. And so the religions in their earliest forms, they profess that the kings and the rulers of these lands were direct descendants of the gods, and down later they'd be downgraded as just representatives. But in order to be a direct representative of a god of a specific land, you had to be born from a long line of succession, which could be traced back to the original god who had power over that land.
Sure.
So, by removing Israel from the land and sending them into Egypt and doing the whole Exodus thing, God was demonstrating, hey, I'm not tied to the land.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be the land where I choose to manifest, but I'm not limited to the land. I'm not reliant on the land for power. And by waiting to crown a king, God prevented even the appearance that his kings were a product of an illicit relationship with a god to
Fair enough,
produce this
yeah.
king. And so when he crowns Saul a king and says, hey, this is going to be my guy, and then he replaces them with David, he even further removes that idea that there is this genetic connection from one king to another back to the god. And so when God founds his kingdom, it's the rulers it's based on invitation. It's based on, will you join me? And this is really huge because it's removed from that place where the ruler was born as the result of the abuse of women.
Right.
And so to have this happen really sets God apart from the other nations in a way that could not have happened, say, if Abraham had just immediately received the land and then Isaac was born, because there was some discussion even among the rabbis, was he Abraham's son or was he a son of God? And so then we get through the judges, where it was Samson. Was he the son of his earthly father, or was he the son of God?
Right.
And so we've got some really entrenched thoughts that had to be broken off in order to make this reveal the character of God. And so when we, that's kind of all an aside, but I did find it interesting how God even took into account the way things could be perceived.
Right.
No matter what truth was spoken about the situation, God took into account what people might think based on the cultural influences.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we get back to Samuel, when we've got this guy, this king, who is later the guy who is the later king of Tyre, and King Hiram, who is the present king of Tyre. And okay, Sorry, my brain went to spaghetti mess with all of this because Hiram is the king of Tyre at this point.
Sure.
Later on, the king of Tyre is going to be identified as someone that will be mistaken for Satan.
Okay.
And to have this guy come down and bring these great gifts to David is a little troubling. I mean, this is the first guy outside of Israel honoring um, this new king of Israel, and it's kind of a little bit of foreshadowing of what's going to happen later on. David's going to face some temptation as a king, and some of them he's going to do well, and some of them he's going to fail miserably at. And so the question of all of the heroes is, do you hang on for God's promises, or do you accept the gifts of Satan? And so now in this moment, because there is no connection with Hiram and Satan, the Satan figure, the king of Tyre, it's a celebrated event. It's seen as completely appropriate.
Right.
But the reason why it becomes conflicted is because we do have all of this, we have that baggage tied to Tyre. And the reason why I bring that up is because I wanted to show how what we know about what happens in later events within the Bible actually influences the meanings that we put on previous events.
Mhm.
Because there is nothing within the scripture or even commentary that comes after that suggests that accepting this gift from Hiram is inappropriate or that it's wrong.
Right.
As a matter of fact, in the Bible, it says right there, the verse after Hiram shows up is that this was done because God is causing David to be honored. So this is really important in the case of Hiram because Hiram's going to show back up later. We're going to find him with Solomon when Solomon builds the temple.
Mhm.
And if you know anything about the Illuminati, the Masons, all of that, then Hiram becomes a person of interest within that kind of culture. And I'm not going to go into that now. We may talk about that more when we get to Solomon.
I didn't realize he was such a point of interest.
Oh, it's huge. It's huge. And maybe we can get Doug Overmeyer to come talk about that because I know Doug has researched it extensively. And
Okay.
yeah. And so it's a major part of that culture. And people see this as something horrible that David did, if you think along these lines.
Right. Right.
Then it colors how we look at this view. But I mean, look at verse 12. And David knew the Lord had established him king over Israel and that he'd exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. David is seeing this. He's telling us how to read this. Hiram is honoring David because God is honoring Israel. And he's telling these other kings of other nations, this is my guy.
Right.
You need to seal the deal and make sure that you guys get along because he's going to be the one who rules. And so I don't want anyone to read too much in this. Now, I know for some people I've said, here's all the reasons you should, and this was all new to them.
Right.
But for some people, there is that automatic baggage.
Right.
And, I think there's always been some crazy baggage with the building of the temple and the building of these great palaces because, you can go back in a lot of literature and there's even stories about how Solomon managed to subdue demons and force them to do labor on the
Sure.
temple. And so there's some stories where Hiram was the one who helped him perfect this magic and make it happen. And, so there's always been some kind of weird obsession or conspiracy theory that goes along with these events. And they're really fascinating because it shows you how far you can take a good story.
Yeah.
But again, we got to stick with what the Bible says, and there's nothing negative about this at all. And I also want to point out, because this kind of fits with how we should read it. If you'll notice in Ezekiel 28, when you go back, God commands that Ezekiel lament over the king of Tyre.
Hmm.
And so the idea of lamenting this is something we should already be familiar with, because David has lamented the death of Saul.
Right.
And Samuel grieved over Saul being displaced. God regretted, or this is part of the process. And when you look at this, I mean, it also raises some really interesting questions about how we should view the rebellion of the divine council. If God's going to lament over the king of Tyre, especially when you see the shared language between David and Ezekiel's laments,
Hmm.
and you you kind of it opens a new world of the idea of, or new realm of ideas about God's connection
Hmm.
with these beings who would dare turn their back on him, and the idea that Saul had to be replaced, and now these other kings from the other nations are going to be replaced because they're representatives of God,
Right.
of their gods. You see this playing out in a microcosm,
Sure.
and so you've got to hold all those pieces in place at once, and trying to talk through them can be really interesting. So now in rabbinic tradition, Hiram is really celebrated. He's actually upheld as a model for non-Jews to follow,
Okay.
because he does honor the king of Israel. And according to Terek et Zuta, which is one of the minor tractates of the Talmud, he's counted among 9 people to enter the Garden of Eden in their lifetime and live to tell about it. So, see, he wasn't always a bad guy, is what I'm saying.
Right.
And he wasn't always considered to be a questionable figure, but it seems like that was like a little brief period of time in there. So
Yeah, I mean, and that's not at all uncommon in literature to have someone who starts good and turns bad.
right. And this is where things get convoluted. And I bring all this stuff in because the convoluted nature of it is based on outside sources, and it's based on taking things out of context as opposed to just reading what's on the page.
Mhm.
And so that's what it comes back to. So there's some debate on when this actually happened, whether this had happened immediately after David conquered Jerusalem, or it's later in his reign. It really doesn't matter when it happened. The fact is, we're told it happened.
Mhm.
So, and also a lot of things in the Bible, the precise date, the writer doesn't care about, or he would have given you better markers.
Well, that's not how ancient history was done, and the precision of the calendar. I mean, we didn't even really have that until much later.
Well, you had to have ways of accurately documenting what was going on and retaining those documents. And, let's face it, there weren't a lot of libraries for,
Hmm.
a long time, up until Alexander the Great. And we aren't close to that at this point. So, because, papyrus and all of that good stuff. Anyway,
Yep.
so anyway,
I'm with
verse
you.
13. And David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. And these were the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem. Now, we've already had a previous list of kids who were born to him in Hebron. This list does not include those kids, because now we're just talking about the ones born in Jerusalem. So we have Shemua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. Some great,
whole lot of names.
a whole lot of names. Now, a better translation, let's start with this, would be he took wives while in Jerusalem, not after he was, or from Jerusalem. Zamora explains why the ESV says from, because
Okay.
it makes more sense that he married women, the idea that he took women from within the city. He's conquered it. Now he's going to take women within. That's got some negative connotations, obviously, but it actually makes more sense that he marries women from prominent tribes and leaders within the nation, because even though the wives aren't named here, the fact that they would be from other Israelites who were prominent and held power, this would be another way for him to unite the nation under his
Right.
rule.
Right.
So we don't want to make too much of that word from. It is a plausible explanation or translation, but also is the word while. So he took women while in Jerusalem. So First Chronicles 3:5-9 tells us that his first 4 sons in that list, because we have the same list over again, were born to Bathsheba. And it inserts 2 more names between Elishua and Nepheg, which gives us a total of 13 sons. And we're specifically told that these sons are born to wives, not concubines, because there were other sons born to the concubines.
Right.
So we should also note that in Chronicles, we have the only daughter to David named, which is Tamar. And she's going to be an important player in the upcoming stories. Now, what?
Yep.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting thing to go into. Now, it's interesting to note that in those first 4 sons, the third son, if you notice the name, is Nathan.
Mhm.
Now, I think all of us know that Nathan is the prophet who confronts David after David has taken Bathsheba back to his place and had Uriah killed, and that they have a child together who dies, and then they have Solomon who will become the king.
Mhm.
But Nathan was the one who said David had done something wrong and David needed to do the right thing from here on out. And so I think it's really interesting that Bathsheba, because it's the women who name the children, not
Mhm.
the men, Bathsheba decides to name her third son after the prophet who stood up for her
Mhm.
in this time, because you never really get any insight into how Bathsheba feels about any of this stuff that's
Right.
going on. She's just there. And so for her to name a
At least you
son,
don't get much insight into it till after the fact. I mean, there's evidence for how she might have felt about things later on,
much later, and
like after David dies.
exactly. But I do think it's interesting that she would decide that this is the name that her son should have. And I don't think I've ever had anyone mention that from any kind of sermon or Sunday school lesson, because it is insightful.
Mhm.
And you name your child after somebody who means something to you.
Mhm.
And now the other thing that I found was interesting, if you go over to the genealogy of Jesus in Luke 3, in verse 31, we find that Nathan is specifically named in Jesus' genealogy. Now, if you go to Matthew, the genealogy comes through Solomon, because we have two different lists of people and family members in the 2 gospels, and we'll talk about why that is later. But the fact that it is Nathan who's named after the prophet who becomes the ancestor of Jesus according to Luke is I don't know, it just really um I think it's fascinating. And so I am
Did you get lost in your notes again?
I did, and I can't figure out what's going on. So,
You
oh,
gotta learn to
yeah,
type.
that's I do, I know. It'd save us a lot of time. Okay, so now the fact that David's taking so many wives, it should start to cause us a little bit of unease, because up to this point, he's been the guy who's cast aside, the leading social conventions and the way culture is supposed to be carried out. And he's the guy who's been showing us a better expression about how God's kingdom is supposed to operate.
Mhm.
And so, you wonder, okay, has he gotten lazy with his success, or maybe in the fact that he stopped fighting for a minute, he's just going to go with the flow? I mean, it's been 10 to 12 years since Samuel first anointed him, and we've talked about that before. But during those 10 years, he was basically on the run from Saul. He's been living with the Philistines, and maybe now that he's got a place where he can settle down, he's just kind of, oh, I can let my guard down. I don't have to
Mhm.
work so hard. And sometimes I think as believers, a lot of us operate a little better when our feet are being held to the fire. And, we tend to observe our faith more in the middle of adversity than we do in the day to day.
Yeah, and that I can definitely see how that tends to hold true.
Well, we
I,
aren't weighing each decision. We aren't consciously thinking through everything we're doing and going, okay, this is what I need to do in this situation to be right with God or to honor God. Versus, when you're just living your life, you think, oh, well, surely what I'm doing can't be that bad. It's not that horrible of a thing. And, you know, we see David kind of, he's faltering by
mhm,
taking this many wives. And with this mention of his children who are the result of this horrible event within David's life with Bathsheba, where the writer is kind of making us look ahead to things aren't always going to be this rosy.
right.
And so we have a little bit of a foreshadowing. Now, the great thing is that the instant David has an enemy, he goes right back to being the David we love and respect.
Mhm,
Because in verse 17, we're told the Philistines, when they hear that David's been anointed king over all of Israel, they go up to search for David. And so, while David was just king over Judah, they kind of left him alone. He was still kind of their buddy. He was their
mhm,
friend. He lived with them. He'd served their king, and living in Judah, having your own capital, not a big deal. But now, when you're over all of Israel, now you're a legitimate threat.
sure.
You're going to have an army big enough to pose some kind of threat. And also, if David, his first move is to kick the Jebusites out of Jerusalem, who's to say that the Philistines living in the cities all around aren't going to be the next one to be attacked
Mhm,
because
mhm.
they've been there since Saul's death. And so if David's willing to take Jerusalem, they need to be on guard. And more than be on guard, they better strike first because that's the only way they're going to keep their people safe. So David hears of it and he goes to a stronghold. This is possibly a fortress located somewhere close to Jerusalem. And this is a huge shift. And it's just said so plainly, we kind of forget. Always before, when David had some kind of enemy pursuing him, David had run.
Mhm.
He had never had the opportunity of just going to a fortress and saying, okay, let's make a battle plan.
Sure.
And so now the Philistines, they come out and they spread out over the valley of the Rephaim. So rule number 4 is that geography is important. And in this case, again, we're looking kind of like with the Hiram case. It's important because it's symbolic. You know, David is in Jerusalem. He is in the home of the future temple, and the temple is going to be this representation of the Garden of Eden. You get your flowers, and you've got the palm trees, and you've got they're going to be aligned on the same compass points. The Garden of Eden and the temple. You're going to have cherubim. You're going to have a lampstand that represents the tree of life, and there's going to be precious jewels and metals, the same ones listed and talked about with the Garden of Eden. And the
The what?
that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Telling you gotta
This is
gotta get
bad.
some typing going on. Word
And
processor, you can edit stuff.
yeah,
So you have the lampstand that represents the tree of life. Where
yeah.
are we going with
I
that?
have absolutely no idea. Okay. Oh, it's because I've got this page out of order. So Jerusalem's going to become the place where humanity and God are going to interact. It's going to be
Gotcha.
the central place. And so um when they become the place where God's going to interact, uh, it's going to be reminiscent of Eden because this is the place where God and humanity walked together and they talked. And so we have these points of connection. Jerusalem being on a mountaintop, Eden was located on a mountaintop. We got rivers rolling out, but the valley of the Rephaim is below Jerusalem on the southeastern side,
Okay.
and the north end marks the beginning of the Judean tribal lands and the end of the Judean tribal lands and the beginning of Benjamin's tribal lands. And so the name itself is something that connects us back to early Canaanite inhabitants because when they went to the promised land, what did they see? giants. Also, we have giants among the
Mhm,
Philistines. And so when we talk about the Rephaim, we're talking about giants, we're talking about shades, we're talking about spirits, we're talking about more than just physical beings who can be giants. We're also talking about spiritual forces. And so the battle provides this imagery of God's representative, David, descending from on high to confront a supernatural enemy.
mhm.
And this is the imagery we want from a king whose sole purpose is to fight on God's behalf. And we want that foreshadowing, because what does Jesus do? He's the king who descends on high to confront the enemies of God. And so when we talk about this battle happening in the battle of the valley in the valley of the Rephaim, we have this beautiful imagery that foreshadows so much and gives us a whole different viewpoint of this is more than just a battle for land. That David's very rule and reign is about establishing sacred space, a place for God to interact with humanity, and a place where God can make himself known, and not just make himself known, but he's going to invite you to be a part of it.
Sure.
And so I think one of the things that we kind of forget with all of this, we get caught up in the historical side of things. Was David a real person? And, did he actually do these things? I believe he was. And I believe these things did happen. But the point is, we're supposed to be preparing ourselves to embrace Jesus through this imagery of David's rule. So that's kind of, we'll stop right there. We'll pick up with the next story or the rest of the battle here in a little bit. Well, a little bit for you and me. So
Yeah. Next week for everyone else.
Right.
And in the meantime, if you want to talk to us about this, get us organized, keep us in line, whatever we got to do.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. My apologies.
It happens. Hit us up, ravencreeksc.com. There's a contact page on there where it gets you the email to us. There is Raven Creek SC on all the social media where you can find us. Also check out some of the other things we've got going on. We've got Change My Mind with Luke T. Harrington. We host him here. And then The Commentarians with Joe Zaragoza. Lots of interesting episodes lately. I've really been enjoying The Commentarians. So, go hit those up. And in the meantime, we will see you on the internet. Thanks. Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.